Chapter 5. It was midday in Mos Espa, and Anakin was cleaning fan switches in Watto's junkyard when his master loudly summoned him into the junk shop to watch the store. Inside, Watto was talking with a tall, bearded man who was dressed like a farmer. The man was accompanied by a rubbery-jointed humanoid alien with mottled skin and eyes on the top of his head, a girl dressed in rough peasant clothes, and a dome-headed blue astromech droid. While the tall man and the astromech followed the hovering Watto to the scrapyard to look at engine parts, Anakin hitched himself up onto the counter that snaked through the shop and studied the girl. She had delicate features, her skin too perfect for a peasant. She appeared to be a few years older than him, and Anakin found himself unable to take his eyes off her. "Are you an angel?" he blurted out. She smiled, her heart soared, and said, "What?" "An angel," he responded as she stepped closer to him. "I've heard the deep space pilots talk about them. They are the most beautiful creatures in the universe. They live on the moons of Iago, I think." "You're a funny little boy," she said sweetly. "How do you know so much?" "I listen to all the traders and star pilots who come through here. I'm a pilot, you know, and someday I'm going to fly away from this place." "You're a pilot?" she said, as if she found it hard to believe. All my life." "How long have you been here?" "Since I was very little. 3, I think. My mom and I were sold to Gardula the Hutt, but she lost us, betting on the pod races." Sounding surprised and alarmed, the girl said, "You're a slave?" Even though the girl had assumed correctly, Anakin didn't like being called a slave, and he felt stung by her question. "I'm a person," he said, glaring at her. "And my name is Anakin." "I'm sorry, I don't fully understand," the girl replied, and Anakin sensed she meant it. Unable to hold his gaze, she glanced around the shop's interior, as if seeking answers from the assorted scrap that lined the walls. This is a strange place to me." Anakin remembered his own arrival to Tatooine and had to admit that he found it strange too. He tried to ignore the clumsy, mottled-skinned alien while he continued talking with the girl for a few more minutes until the tall man, the astromech, returned with Watto. The man announced that his group was leaving, and Anakin felt heartsick as the girl walked out the door. After Watto gave Anakin permission to leave the shop, the boy caught up with the 3 Outlanders and the astromech. When they learned a sandstorm was approaching, Anakin persuaded them to take temporary refuge at his home, where he introduced them to his mother and C-3PO. He discovered that the man was a Jedi Knight named Qui-Gon Jinn, the girl was 14-year-old Padme Naberrie, the clumsy alien was a Gungan named Jar Jar Binks, and the astromech was R2-D2. When R2-D2 observed that the protocol droid, devoid of exterior plating, appeared to be naked, C-3PO became quite embarrassed. Anakin had suspected that Qui-Gon Jinn was a Jedi even before the man admitted it in so many words. He had spotted Qui-Gon's lightsaber dangling from his belt on their way to Anakin's home, and he couldn't help wondering if Qui-Gon had come to Tatooine to free the slaves. Although Qui-Gon revealed few details about himself, Anakin could tell that he was a good and honorable man, the kind that had always been in that had always been a short supply in Anakin's upbringing. Anakin admired the way Qui-Gon held himself with quiet confidence. When Jar Jar Binks made the mistake of using his own long tongue to snatch up a piece of food from the dining table, Anakin was both amused and amazed to see Qui-Gon's hand flash out with lightning speed to seize the Gungan's darting tongue with his thumb and forefinger. "Don't do that again," Qui-Gon said with some severity before he released his grip and Jar Jar's tongue snapped back into his mouth. Anakin thought, "Wizard." Suddenly, he found himself wishing that Qui-Gon would teach him how to be a Jedi. But because Anakin had experienced enough disappointments in his life, it was difficult for him to imagine this could ever happen. While Anakin and his mother sat with their new friends around the dining table, he told them of his dreams of becoming a Jedi. He learned that Padme was a handmaiden to Queen Amidala of the planet Naboo, and that Qui-Gon had been escorting the Queen and her entourage on an important mission to the planet Coruscant when their starship had been damaged, and they were forced to land on Tatooine without funds for the necessary repairs. Hoping to help, Anakin explained that a big pod race, the Boonta Eve Classic, was scheduled for the following day. He volunteered to enter the race, which offered prize money that would more than pay for the parts they needed. Anakin, Shmi protested. But I won't let you. Watto doesn't know I've built it. Turning to Qui-Gon, he said, you could make him think it was yours and get him to let me pilot it for you. Although Padme liked this idea about as much as Shmi did, Anakin was confident his plan, as well as his secret pod racer, would work. The Boonta Eve Classic was the most dangerous race Anakin had ever flown in. It was a vicious, free-for-all competition, and more than one racer became victim to the high-speed turns, rocky obstacles, and dirty tricks of their dastardly adversaries. The race's start had been difficult for Anakin. When he gunned his pod racer's engines at the starting signal, his turbines went dead, and he almost felt sick as he peered through his goggles to see the other pilots blasting off across the starlight flats, leaving him gasping in their dust. He lost precious seconds as he struggled with his controls, but when he finally managed to make the radon Ulzer's fire, he threw his vehicle forward and launched out of Mos Espa Arena at top speed. Soaring through the twisting chasms and over broad flats, Anakin managed to catch up with the other pod racers during the first lap. As the towering rock formations that dotted Mushroom Mesa went past him, he caught the sound of burning fuel a split second before he saw the scattered, smoking remains of the green engine pod that had been piloted by a Grand named Mahonic. Somehow, he knew in his gut that Sebulba was responsible for the crash and had no illusions that the Grand had survived. Gripping his controls, Anakin gnashed his teeth and thought, I'm not going to die like that. Anakin progressed at furious speed, maneuvering past several competitors as he sent his pod racer faster through the Boonta's exotic named perils of Jag Crag Gorge, Laguna Caves, and Bindi Bend, while other pilots slowed slightly to negotiate the notoriously twisty chasm known as the Corkscrew. Anakin maintained a steady high speed until he arrived at Devil's Doorknob, a passage so narrow that pilots were required to flip their vehicles on their sides to travel through it. With expert skill beyond his years, he flipped his pod to launch out of Devil's Doorknob, then accelerated to even greater speed over the broad expanse of the Dead Sea bed known as Hutt Flats. Moments later, Mos Espa Arena came into view, and then he hurtled past the crowds who had watched his delayed departure only minutes earlier. There were still 2 laps to go. Anakin knew he was rapidly gaining on the leading racers. As his pod shot out of Beggar's Canyon, he caught sight of Mars Guo far up ahead, just behind Sebulba. Suddenly, one of Mars Guo's engines exploded, and a moment later, his pod was flying in all directions. Anakin plunged his own pod dangerously close to the ground in a desperate effort to evade the fiery airborne debris, but one large chunk of stray metal struck the steel-tin control cable that linked his pod to his starboard engine. The control cable broke free, and Anakin's pod, now linked only to the port engine, began spinning out of control. Straining against the belt in his cockpit, Anakin tightened his neck muscles and clenched his teeth to prevent his head from snapping back. Stay focused! He sensed he was still traveling forward, and knew that the only reason he hadn't crashed so far was because the energy binder arc between the 2 engines had not yet failed. As the surface of Tatooine blurred and spiraled around him, he punched at his cockpit controls until he stabilized the pod, then reached for an emergency tool. His extendable magnetic retriever. He reached out with the tool, aiming its tip at the metal end of the starboard control cable that whipped and flailed alongside his cockpit. There was a satisfying clank as the magnetic retriever locked onto the cable's end. Anakin felt his arm strain as he pulled back on the cable, then he thrust the tool directly into the starboard cable socket. An instant later, he had regained control of his ship. Anakin didn't congratulate himself. His momentary loss of control had allowed the Sexto pilot Gascano and a couple of other pilots to pass him, and so Bulba was still in the lead. Anakin did what he had to do. He kept going, only faster. He swung around Gascano, but as he attempted to pass the Vecnoid pilot Teamto Pegales, he felt a sudden bone-jarring jolt as Pegales swerved to deliberately smack one of his long engines against Anakin's pod. Anakin sat tight in his cockpit and stayed in control to lead Pegales out of the Laguna Cave to emerge at the base of the wide, high-walled stretch called Canyon Dune Turn. Crack! Despite the roar of his engines, Anakin heard the shot from above. A millisecond later, bright sparks flashed in front of him as fire projectiles pinged off his pod. Stand, people! They're shooting at me! He pushed his throttle levers, which sent him faster across the canyon. Anakin made it, but Gallus wasn't so fortunate. Anakin caught up with Sebulba in the corkscrew, but the cruel Dug flashed his engines directly in front of the young human. Anakin's pod fell back, but he was still in second place as he followed Sebulba's pod sideways out through Devil's Doorknob. Less than a minute later, Anakin followed Sebulba again through Mos Espa Arena. Only one more lap! Anakin kept on Sebulba's tail through the course and was almost directly behind him when they began swerving through the narrow confines of Beggar's Canyon. Sebulba swung hard to the side, forcing Anakin off the course and onto the steep gradient of a service ramp. A moment later, Anakin's engines were carrying his pod up and out of the canyon, launching him skyward. No, Anakin thought. If he didn't win the race and the prize money, he wouldn't be able to help the Jedi buy the starship parts he needed to leave Tatooine. And he wanted very much to help the Jedi and the girl who traveled with him. I can't lose! When his pod reached its maximum repulsive altitude, Anakin stayed calm as the vehicle arched back towards Tatooine's surface. Far below, he could see Sebulba's pod still traveling through the canyon. Keeping his eyes on Sebulba's position, Anakin steered into a steep dive. He felt the air tear against his cheeks as he plunged back into the canyon, then angled his pod and accelerated to position himself in front of the enraged Dug. The thrill of being in the lead didn't last long. As Anakin and Sebulba headed through jet chute on their way to the corkscrew, Anakin's left engine overheated and began billowing smoke. The boy's nimble fingers quickly adjusted the controls to correct the malfunction, but as the two pods blasted out of Devil's Doorknob and over the final stretch of hot flats, Sebulba began ramming Anakin from the side in a last nasty effort to force him out of the race. Anakin thought, he's crazy! The Dug slammed into Anakin again, but instead of knocking Anakin off course, the two pod steering rods became tangled and locked onto each other. Anakin glanced at Sebulba and saw the Dug frowning. If they remained locked in this position all the way over the finish line, the race would be a tie, but Anakin knew that would never happen. Sebulba would either kill me or get us both killed before he'd allow a tie. Anakin jostled his throttle levers back and forth. I have to break free! There was a loud snap as Anakin's pod broke free from Sebulba's, and then the Dug's engines exploded. Sebulba shouted as his shattered pod began crashing through the sand. Anakin swerved to avoid the debris, then accelerated for the finish line. I did it! I won! I won! The crowd in the arena went wild. After the race, a jubilant Anakin met with his mother, Padme, Jar Jar, R2-D2, and C-3PO in the main hangar at the arena where Watto had delivered the starship parts that Qui-Gon had requested. Anakin hadn't expected a celebration of his victory, but any hope of spending more time with his new friends ended when Qui-Gon showed up a few minutes later, looking to his traveling companions and said, "Let's go. We've got to get these parts back to the ship." Anakin bit his lower lip. He wished he could leave Tatooine too, but knew it was pointless to say so. As Padme and the others prepared to leave, he looked up at Qui-Gon, who said, "I have a few things to do before I leave. Go back home with your mother, and I'll meet you there in about an hour." After returning home with Shmi and C-3PO and getting cleaned up, Anakin could not resist going outside to meet with some enthusiastic youngsters who'd seen him in the bunta. He enjoyed their attention and did his best to recount in detail the numerous hazards he had encountered during the race. Most of the kids were very impressed. They listened attentively until a young Rhodian, speaking in Huttese, said, "Too bad you didn't win fair and square." Anakin glanced at the Rhodian and said, "You're calling me a cheater?" "Yeah," the Rhodian said. "No other way a human could have won. I'm guessing you probably..." Before the Rhodian could say another word, Anakin had knocked him to the sandy street. The other kids began shouting as Anakin straddled the Rhodian and began punching him. Only a few blows had been exchanged before a long shadow appeared over both boys. Distracted, Anakin glanced up to see Qui-Gon standing beside him. A moment later, the Rhodian shoved Anakin off of him. Gazing down at Anakin, Qui-Gon said flatly, "What's this all about?" "He said I cheated," Anakin glowered. Keeping his eyes fixed on Anakin, Qui-Gon raised his eyebrows slightly and said, "Did you?" Anakin was mildly outraged by the question. After all, Qui-Gon knew he hadn't cheated. Wondering why Qui-Gon didn't defend him, Anakin snapped, "No!" Unruffled, Qui-Gon looked to the Rhodian and asked, "Do you still think he cheated?" In Huttese, the Rhodian answered, "Yes, I do." As Anakin pushed himself up from the ground, Qui-Gon said, "Well, Annie, you know the truth. You'll just have to tolerate his opinion. Fighting won't change it." "Maybe not," Anakin thought as he walked off with Qui-Gon, leaving the Rhodian and the other kids behind. Still, he wasn't sure that tolerance was the best option. If you don't defend your honor, no one will. He wondered if Jedi ever had to defend their honor, but was reluctant to ask Qui-Gon. Even though the Jedi hadn't scolded him for fighting the Rhodian, Qui-Gon had made it fairly obvious that he hadn't approved. As they walked a short distance back to Anakin's home, Qui-Gon explained that repairs were already underway to Queen Amidala's starship, and that he'd sold Anakin's pod. Handing a small pouch filled with credits to Anakin, Qui-Gon said, "Hey, these are yours." Feeling the weight of the bag, Anakin exclaimed, "Yes!" Followed by Qui-Gon, he entered his home, where he found his mother sitting at her work table. "Mom," he cried, "we stole the pod. Look at all the money we have." "My goodness," Shmi said as Anakin revealed the contents of the pouch he carried. But that's so wonderful, Annie." Standing in the doorway, Qui-Gon added, "And he has been freed." Anakin turned away from his mother and looked up at Qui-Gon. Wondering if he'd heard right, Anakin said, "What? You're no longer a slave," Qui-Gon said. Still slightly stunned by this unexpected news, Anakin looked back to his mother and said, "Did you hear that?" "Now you can make your dreams come true, Annie," his mother said. "You are free." Then she sighed and looked down at the dirt floor. Anakin thought his mother looked sad and couldn't understand why she would be. Before he could ask, she turned her gaze to Qui-Gon and said, "Will you take him with you? Is he to become a Jedi?" "Yes," Qui-Gon said. "Our meeting was not a coincidence. Nothing happens by accident." Suspecting he really was dreaming, Anakin faced the Jedi and said, "You mean I get to come with you in your starship?" Kneeling down so he was almost eye level with the boy, Qui-Gon said, "Anakin, training to become a Jedi is not an easy challenge, and even if you succeed, it's a hard life." "But I want to go," Anakin said. "It's what I've always dreamed of doing." Turning away from Qui-Gon, he looked imploringly to his mother and said, "Can I go, Mom?" Shmi smiled. "Anakin, this path has been placed before you. The choice is yours alone." Anakin hesitated only a moment, then said, "I want to do it." "Then pack your things," Qui-Gon said. "We haven't much time." "Yippee!" Anakin shouted as he ran toward his bedroom, but then he stopped dead as an awful realization suddenly occurred to him. Letting his gaze travel from Qui-Gon to his mother and back to the Jedi again, he said, "What about Mom? Is she free too?" "I tried to free your mother, Annie," Qui-Gon said, "but Watto wouldn't have it." "What?" Anakin felt as if he'd been kicked. He walked slowly back to his mother and said, "You're coming with us, aren't you, Mom?" Still seated beside her work table, Shmi reached out and took Anakin's hand in hers. "Son, my place is here," she said. "My future is here. It is time for you to let go." Anakin frowned. "I don't want things to change." But you can't stop the change, Shmi said, any more than you can stop the sun from setting. Then she pulled her son close against her and hugged him tight. Oh, I love you, she said. Precious seconds passed, then she held Anakin out at arm's length and said, now hurry. She gave his back a slight push before he trotted off to his bedroom, but without so much enthusiasm. C-3PO's skeletal form had been deactivated and stood as silent and still as a statue as Anakin entered his room. Anakin flips a switch on the droid's neck, and a moment later, C-3PO's eyes winked on. Oh, the droid said, wobbling slightly as if he were surprised to find himself in a standing position. Oh my! Then he saw the boy. Oh, hello, Master Anakin. As Anakin gathered up some of his belongings, he said, well, 3PO, I've been freed, and I'm going away in a starship. Master Anakin, you are my maker, and I wish you well. However, I should prefer it if I were a little more completed. I'm sorry I wasn't able to finish you, 3PO. Give you coverings and all, Anakin says he stuffed some things into a travel sack. I'm going to miss working on you. You've been a great pal. Anakin slung the pack over his shoulder, then added, I'll make sure Mom doesn't sell you or anything. C-3PO's head recoiled slightly, and with genuine concern he said, sell me? Bye, Anakin said as he left the room. Oh my! The droid exclaimed from behind. Qui-Gon and Shmi watched Anakin emerge from his room. Suddenly, Anakin remembered the explosive implant within his body. He looked up at Qui-Gon and said, Are you sure I'm not going to blow up when we leave Tatooine? I made sure that Watto deactivated the transmitter for your implant, Qui-Gon said. When we reach our destination, we'll have the implant surgically removed. Okay then, Anakin said. I guess I'm as ready as I'll ever be. Until the moment that Anakin led his mother and Qui-Gon outside the hovel, it hadn't occurred to him that he had no idea when he might return to Tatooine. What if I never come back? He suddenly felt like he was on remote, as if he were not in complete control of his own legs as they carried him into the harsh sunlight. It was hard to think clearly. Everything that had happened since the Jedi arrived on Tatooine seemed more like a dream than a reality. He felt an awful ache in his chest as he said goodbye to his mother, but because he didn't want to disappoint Qui-Gon, he tried not to make a big deal of the situation. He began to walk away with Qui-Gon, trying to concentrate on the path before him, but with each step, his legs felt increasingly heavy. He walked only a short distance when he stopped, then turned and ran back to his mother. Shmi dropped to her knees and held Anakin tightly. Failing to fight back his tears, Anakin cried, I can't do it, Mom. I just can't do it. Annie, Shmi said, holding him at arm's length so she could see his pained face. Will I ever see you again? He sobbed. What does your heart tell you? Anakin tried to listen to his heart, but all he sensed was its ache. I hope so, he said, then added, Yes, I guess. Then we will see each other again. Anakin swallowed hard. I will come back and free you, Mom. I promise. Shmi smiled. Now be brave and don't look back. Don't look back. Anakin did it as his mother instructed, lowering his gaze to the sand-packed street as he followed Qui-Gon away from the hovels. Each step was an effort to stay balanced, as if he could not completely trust his legs from stopping or turning him back toward his mother. He trudged forward, trying to keep up with Qui-Gon's measured strides. He choked back a sob and felt his throat go dry. Thanks to the arid air, he did not have to wipe away his tears, for they evaporated faster than he could cry. Making their way out of Mos Espa, Qui-Gon and Anakin stopped briefly at the marketplace so Anakin could say goodbye to his friend Jira, an old woman who sold fruits called Pallies. Seated behind her small fruit stand, Jira's weathered face brightened at Anakin's approach. Anakin announced, I'm free. Before Jira could comment, he handed her some of his winnings and said, Here, buy yourself a cooling unit with this, or else I'll worry about you. Astonished, Jira gaped for a moment, then said, Can I give you a hug? Sure, Anakin said as he leaned in close to Jira. Oh, I'll miss you, Annie, Jira said as she released him. You're the kindest boy in the galaxy. Beaming, she wagged a finger at him and added, You take care. Okay, Anakin said. I will. Bye. He trudged off with Qui-Gon. Anakin and Qui-Gon were at the very outskirts of Mos Espa when Anakin had a strange feeling, like we're being followed. He doubted that the feeling was worth mentioning, but a moment later, Qui-Gon stopped fast and spun as he activated and swung his lightsaber at something behind them. Once again amazed by the Jedi speed, Anakin gasped as the lightsaber swept to a spherical black repulsive device that had been hovering in the air at their backs. Neatly halved, the shattered contraption fell to the sand. Qui-Gon bent down to examine the parts as they sizzled and sparked. Anakin said, "What is it?" "A probe droid," Qui-Gon said. "Very unusual. Not like anything I've seen before." Anakin had heard of probe droids before. They resembled security droids which were engineered to watch over places, but their specialized sensors and programming were more for spying. He heard rumors that some probe droids were equipped with weapons and that the Hutts used them as assassins. Glancing around for any sign of the probe droid's unknown owner, Qui-Gon rose quickly and said, "Come on." He turned and began to run, leading Anakin away from Mos Espa and into the desert wastes. Anakin did his best to keep up with the tall Jedi as they raced over the dunes. But by the time Anakin sighted Queen Amidala's long, sleek starship just up ahead of them, he was trailing some distance but behind the Jedi. Anakin had never seen a ship like it. Its surface was so highly reflective that it was literally blinding in the sunlight, and Anakin had to squint to look at it directly. As he fell farther behind Qui-Gon, he feared he'd never reach that beautiful ship. "Qui-Gon, sir, wait!" Anakin yelled as he trudged forward across the shifting sand. "I'm tired." Qui-Gon spun, and Anakin thought the Jedi was looking at him, but then heard the hum of an engine approaching from behind. Qui-Gon shouted, "Anakin, drop!" Without hesitation, Anakin threw himself down upon the sand just as a side-shaped speeder swept past him. Anakin lifted his gaze to see a black-clad figure ignite a red-bladed lightsaber and leap from the speeder. As the speeder hurtled forward without its rider, Qui-Gon activated his own lightsaber just in time to block a strike from his deadly assailant. "Go!" Qui-Gon shouted to Anakin. "Tell him to take off." Again, Anakin obeyed the Jedi without question. As he got up and ran, he caught but a glimpse of the Dark Warrior's face, which was covered with jagged red and black markings. Anakin didn't stop to ponder whether one color was the creature's skin color and the other was tattooed. He just kept running, and as tired as he was from the long run from Mos Espa, he never ran faster than he did when he bolted for the starship. He practically flew up the landing ramp and into the ship's forward hull. Just inside the hatchway, he found Padme talking to a tall man in a leather tunic. "Qui-Gon's in trouble," Anakin blurted out between gasps. "He says to take off, now." The man scowled at Anakin and demanded, "Who are you?" "He's a friend," Padme answered for Anakin as she grabbed the breathless boy's arm and led him to the ship's bridge. The man followed them as they entered the bridge, where two other men, an older fellow in a pilot uniform and a younger man in a robe, were checking the controls. "Qui-Gon's in trouble," said the man who had followed Padme and Anakin. The young man in the robe hunkered down beside the pilot and said, "Take off." Then he peered through the ship's viewport, pointed and said, "Over there, fly low." Anakin stood behind the robed man and followed his gaze to see Qui-Gon join the Dark Warrior. In the short time he'd known Qui-Gon, Anakin had come to regard the Jedi as an invincible being, but now he genuinely feared for Qui-Gon's life. The ship's engines fired, then it lifted from the ground and began moving through the air toward Qui-Gon's position. Anakin held his breath as they passed over the fighting figures, then glanced at a monitor that displayed the forward hold. A moment later, Qui-Gon rolled into the hold and collapsed against the floor. Anakin realized Qui-Gon had leaped to the ship's still extended landing ramp. He made it! The robed man ran from the bridge to the forward hold and Anakin followed. Qui-Gon was still catching his breath as he introduced Anakin to a Jedi apprentice, Obi-Wan Kenobi. Anakin's departure from Tatooine was followed by a dizzying series of events. His arrival in the skyscraper-covered world of Coruscant, home of the Galactic Senate and the Jedi Temple, his meeting with Yoda, Mace Windu, and the other members of the Jedi High Council who tested his abilities with the powers that they call the Force, the Council's subsequent rejection of Qui-Gon's request to train Anakin to become a Jedi, even though Qui-Gon insisted that Anakin was the Chosen One. Anakin's mind spun. Chosen One? Chosen for what? Before Anakin could begin to fully comprehend his situation, he was traveling again with Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan as they escorted the ornately attired Queen Amidala back to Naboo, which had been invaded by the droid armies of the Neimoidian Trade Federation. On Naboo, Anakin was stunned to discover that Padme Naberrie had impersonated a handmaiden for security reasons, that she was really Padme Amidala, the true queen of Naboo. Suddenly swept up into the battle between the Trade Federation's droids and the inhabitants of Naboo, Anakin had just taken refuge in a starfighter cockpit when Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan were confronted by the same dark warrior who had appeared on Tatooine. Although Anakin had not intended to commandeer the starfighter to destroy the large ship that controlled the Federation's droids, his actions brought a swift end to the invasion. After the battle, Anakin found Obi-Wan at the Queen's palace. From Obi-Wan's grim expression, Anakin knew what had happened. Qui-Gon Jinn was dead. 3 days later, the Jedi Council honored Qui-Gon's final wish and allowed Anakin to become Obi-Wan's apprentice. When Anakin realized that even the newly appointed Supreme Chancellor Palpatine, the former senator of Naboo, was aware of his role in destroying the droid control ship, he thought he'd gone as far as a slave from Tatooine ever could. But his adventures were only beginning.